Hi there, welcome to Please Sleep channel, where we tell you the kind of stories that make you question your ancestors and maybe help you fall asleep in the process tonight. We're diving into a topic that's often romanticized, misunderstood, and frankly, very awkward once you know the details. We're talking about sex, Viking sex, and no, it's not what the movies told you. Forget the shirtless warriors and steamy longhouse scenes. The truth is a lot more legal, political, ritualistic, and occasionally disturbing. From marriage contracts that read like livestock sales to bedroom rituals that involved magic and public witnesses. The Vikings approached intimacy with all the warmth of a frozen fjord. In this video, we'll explore how relationships worked in Norse society, what the gods had to say about gender and desire, and why insulting someone's manhood could literally land you in court. It's a history of lust, laws, legends, and the occasional horse. So grab a blanket, turn down the lights, and get ready to be very uncomfortable in a very quiet voice, because the Viking world was a lot of things, but sexy, well, not quite. Let's begin. Forget everything you think you know about Viking romance. There were no candlelit dinners, no love letters carved into rune stones, and definitely no swooning. Viking relationships were about one thing: contracts in the Viking Age. Marriage wasn't a personal choice, it was a business agreement, negotiated by the heads of two families. A father didn't give his daughter away out of love. He sold her as part of a complex transaction involving land, livestock, and political alliances. The groom's family would pay a bride price, called a manda, which was essentially compensation to the bride's family for the loss of her labor and reproductive capacity. In return, the bride would bring a dowry, or hymen filja, which included things like household goods, clothing, and occasionally servants. This exchange was carefully negotiated, often witnessed by elders and relatives, and recorded orally because writing things down wasn't really the Viking style. The marriage contract would even outline the terms of divorce, just in case things went south, and yes, divorce was allowed. It was surprisingly progressive in that sense either the man or woman could initiate it, as long as proper procedures were followed. But don't get too excited about Viking feminism just yet. While women did have some agency, particularly when it came to reclaiming their dowries, their choices were still heavily restricted by social norms and expectations. Once the contract was finalized, the wedding could begin, and Viking weddings were not small affairs, they were wild. Days-long festivals filled with food, alcohol, music, and ritual. The feast was more than just a party, it was a public declaration of the new union, and it had to be witnessed by the community. Because in a world where literacy was rare, memory and gossip were your best form of documentation. After the feast came the part that makes modern readers squirm: the bedding ceremony. The newlyweds were expected to consummate the marriage, and this act was not always private. In many cases, witnesses, often female relatives, would wait outside the bedroom to ensure the act occurred. In some versions, they would inspect the bed sheets afterward. Why? Because a marriage wasn't considered valid unless it had been physically sealed. Consummation was the glue of the contract, the moment when theory became reality. The pressure to perform, especially on the first night, was enormous, and failure could lead to annulment. Romantic, right? But things got even more clinical. If the bride turned out not to be a virgin, the husband could demand compensation, or even take her family to court. Virginity was a currency, and its perceived loss was treated like property damage. There were even cases in the sagas where women were subjected to humiliating questioning about their past, sometimes in front of entire communities. Yet ironically, men's sexual history was rarely questioned, unless it involved something considered unmanly, which we'll get to later. So who are these brides? Typically, girls married young, often as early as 12 or 13, right after puberty. Men usually waited until their early 20s, once they had the resources to support a household. This meant that Viking marriages often involved a significant age gap, which was considered completely normal. Love might develop over time, but it wasn't expected at the beginning. Marriage was more about uniting families than uniting hearts. But not all unions were arranged. Sometimes, couples did fall in love and marry for emotional reasons, though this was more the exception than the rule. In some sagas, we read about passionate affairs and rebellious elopements. These were usually framed as dramatic, scandalous events entertaining, but frowned upon. Still, they show that Vikings weren't robots. They had feelings. They just weren't always allowed to act on them. The structure of Viking households also shaped sexual dynamics. A wife was expected to manage the home, while the husband worked outside, whether that meant farming, trading, or reading. In wealthier homes, there were also slaves. And here's where things get darker. Slavery was widespread in the Viking world, and sexual exploitation was common. Male and female slaves could be used for labor and pleasure. They had no legal protection, and any children born from these encounters were usually considered illegitimate. The abuse of enslaved people was rarely mentioned in sagas, unless it caused social scandal. For example, if a man favored a slave woman over his wife, it could create tension. But the act itself wasn't condemned. This power imbalance was baked into Viking society, and it complicates any attempt to view their relationships through a modern lens. Even within marriage, consent was not always a given. Wives were expected to fulfill their duties, including in the bedroom. Refusal could lead to social repercussions or even grounds for divorce. And while women could, in theory, reject unwanted advances, doing so came with risks, especially if the man had higher social standing. Sexual fidelity was expected of women more than men. A man could have affairs or take concubines with relatively little consequence. A woman caught cheating, however, could face public shame, divorce, or worse. That said, there were clever women who used the legal system to their advantage. Some manipulated dowry terms to secure more independence. Others sued for divorce under claims of mistreatment or failure to provide. These cases were rare, but not unheard of. They remind us that while Viking society was deeply patriarchal, it wasn't completely monolithic. Women had moments of leverage, usually through wealth, family connections, or sheer cunning. Religious beliefs also played a role in shaping sexual norms. Viking paganism didn't have a clear-cut morality about sex. Fertility was sacred, and gods like Frey and Freyr embodied sensuality and reproduction. There weren't hard prohibitions like those found in later Christian doctrine. What mattered more was honor, family, and social standing. You could be promiscuous as long as it didn't damage your reputation or disrupt the clan. That's why public image was everything. Sexual behavior wasn't judged on morality, it was judged on optics. Were you discreet? Were you dominant? Were you fulfilling your role in society? If yes, then carry on. If no, expect consequences. Eventually, Christianity began to seep into Norse lands, bringing with it new ideas about sin, monogamy, and chastity. This created a cultural clash. Pagan customs didn't disappear overnight. But over generations, the pressure to conform increased. Christian priests condemned fornication, adultery, and polygamy, forcing old traditions to evolve or vanish. By the end of the Viking Age, marriage began to resemble the more familiar Christian model, with church ceremonies, monogamy, and stricter gender roles. But for much of the early period, Viking sex and marriage remained what it had always been: practical, strategic, and only occasionally romantic. In Viking society, reputation wasn't just important, it was everything, and one of the fastest ways to destroy a man's honor was to accuse him of being sexually passive, not violent. Not cruel, just passive. That alone could ruin him. The Vikings had a term for this kind of insult. Now, it didn't just mean calling someone weak, it meant questioning their manhood, their role in sex, and their position in society. The worst thing you could call a man was ragga, which implied that he allowed himself to be penetrated during sex. In a world obsessed with dominance, being the receptive partner regardless of gender context was treated as humiliating and disgraceful. This wasn't about homosexuality in the modern sense. Viking culture didn't care who you slept with nearly as much as how you did it, as long as a man was the dominant, aggressive partner. His reputation stayed intact. But if he crossed the invisible line of passivity, he risked being branded a shameful outcast. And yes, there were consequences, legal ones. If someone accused you of being, or another word suggesting effeminacy or sexual submission, you could take them to court, literally, in the Icelandic Grog's law code. These insults were considered so damaging that they warranted a formal legal challenge. The accuser had to prove the claim or face serious penalties, including fines or exile, which meant Viking men had to be very careful with their trash talk. You couldn't just call someone a coward in bed without evidence, otherwise you'd find yourself standing in front of a local assembly, explaining how and why you thought your neighbor was too soft in the sack. These courtroom traumas weren't about justice in the modern sense. They were about restoring honor, silencing rumors, and maintaining social balance, and they were deadly serious. An unresolved accusation could lead to blood feuds, family retaliation, and even murder. It was that personal. But let's take a step back. Why was this such a big deal? Because in Viking society, masculinity was defined by control. Control over your land, your household, your slaves, and especially your sexual encounters. To be seen as weak in any of these areas was to risk losing your place in the hierarchy. Vikings didn't have modern psychology, but they definitely had gender roles. Men were expected to be strong, assertive, and sexually dominant. Women were expected to be fertile, loyal, and at least officially sexually passive. Anyone who deviated from these expectations risked social punishment, and the law was there to enforce it. Some of the most vivid examples come from the sagas, where rivalries between men often involved not just weapons and battles, but personal insults about sexual behavior. If a man wanted to undermine his enemy, he'd suggest that he was Arga, that he allowed himself to be used like a woman, that he lacked the hardness expected of a real Viking. These weren't throwaway lines, they were strategic attacks, aimed at the deepest vulnerabilities, and they worked. That's why public duels could erupt from what modern audiences might consider playground. Name-calling, but for the Vikings, it was a matter of life and death. Even poetry wasn't safe. Skalds, Norse poets, had to be cautious when composing verses about living people. A poorly chosen word could be interpreted as a nigh, and suddenly the poet was no longer an artist but an outlaw. One famous example is the use of nifstung, or insult poles. A man would carve a humiliating poem into a wooden staff and plant it outside someone else's property, usually with a horse skull mounted on top for dramatic effect. It was a magical, legal, and social curse all in one. The message was clear: this man has no honor, and once your honor was gone, you were vulnerable. You could be exiled, stripped of rights, or attacked without consequence. The law was on your side if your reputation was intact. If not, good luck, of course. All of this created a society obsessed with appearances. Men had to constantly perform their masculinity, avoid looking weak, and prove themselves through aggression on the battlefield, in court, and in bed, and because of this, actual sexual behavior became less about pleasure and more about maintaining dominance. This even extended to accusations of magic. Practicing some form of Norse sorcery was considered suspicious for men, partly because it involved behavior seen as unmanly. If a man was accused of using magic to seduce someone, or to interfere with another man's sexuality, it wasn't just a crime, it was a statement about his identity. Sorcery could undermine the natural order, including sexual roles, and that made it terrifying. That fear ran deep, because the boundaries of acceptable behavior were narrow, and stepping outside them willingly or not could mean social ruin. That's why Viking men were so paranoid about how they were perceived, and why they went to such extreme lengths to defend their reputations. Even if it meant dragging a neighbor to court over a dirty joke, even if it meant killing a rival over a suggestive poem, the stakes were high, and the consequences were often bloody. It's worth noting, too, that women weren't completely absent from this system, while they were less likely to be there. Targets of nigh accusations, they could still be involved. A woman who was too dominant, too outspoken, or too sexually independent might find herself whispered about, judged, or punished in one saga. A woman mocks her husband's manhood so viciously that he is forced to take violent action just to restore his honor. These stories weren't written to entertain, they were warnings. And while they may seem extreme today, they reveal how deeply sexual identity was tied to personal and legal survival. Vikings lived in a world where masculinity was constantly tested, and failure had real-world consequences. So behind the longships and battle cries was a fragile social order, upheld not just by swords but by silence, shame, and endless paranoia about what it meant to be a real man. In Viking culture, childhood wasn't something you got to enjoy for very long. There were no teenagers, no phase of finding yourself, and definitely no gap years to explore the fjords. You were either a child or an adult, and the transition between the two happened too fast. For girls, adulthood started when their bodies began to change, often around the age of 12 or 13. This biological shift meant one thing. They were now considered marriageable, not ready, not emotionally mature, just physically capable of bearing children. That was enough. Girls were quickly prepared for life as wives, homemakers, and future mothers. They were given adult clothing, trained in weaving, food storage, and healing, and sometimes subjected to awkward public rituals that marked their transition from girl to woman. These ceremonies, often overseen by elder women in the community, included symbolic acts like the offering of knives or keys, tools associated with womanly responsibilities. In more elite households, the transition might involve an actual betrothal, or at the very least, serious negotiations about it, whether they wanted to or not. The message was clear: childhood was over for boys. The shift to manhood was less biological and more performative. You became a man when you could fight, hunt, or work like one. That meant learning to handle weapons, tend to animals, build structures, and survive the harsh Nordic environment. Some were tested with dangerous tasks, climbing cliffs, killing their first animal, or enduring extreme cold without complaint. Others were thrown straight into raiding parties. Nothing like a little casual violence to say welcome to adulthood. The absence of formal education meant learning came from observation, repetition, and storytelling. Young boys listened closely to their fathers, uncles, and clan warriors, memorizing every detail about battle tactics, sea travel, and masculine conduct. Crying was discouraged. Complaining was punished, and anything resembling weakness was a source of shame. Puberty wasn't celebrated so much as expected. You grew up, you did your job, and you didn't talk about your feelings. Sex education, if it can even be called that, came in the form of overheard conversations, crude jokes, and heavily symbolic myths. There were no books, no diagrams, and certainly no healthy conversations about consent. If you were lucky, an older sibling or a slightly less drunk uncle might explain the mechanics. If not, you figured it out on your own eventually. Mistakes were part of the process. And sometimes those mistakes led to unwanted pregnancies. In that case, the community had rules. If a girl got pregnant before marriage, it could destroy her reputation. The boy, if identified, might be pressured into marriage or punished by the girl's family. But often, the blame landed squarely on the girl. Her value as a potential bride dropped significantly. And if her family couldn't cover the shame with money or favors, she might end up cast out. Boys had more leeway, as always. Their sexual experiments were tolerated so long as they didn't dehumiliate a high-status family or break any sacred oaths. And yes, oaths were sacred even when it came to sex. In some parts of Scandinavia, premarital sex wasn't completely taboo, but it had limits. If you promised to marry someone and then took their virginity only to walk away, you could face legal action. A man's word was his bond. Break it, and you didn't just anger one person, you angered a clan. The pressure to remain honorable often clashed with hormones, but Viking youth adapted. Relationships, when they happened, were discreet. Courting rituals were clumsy and often controlled by the girl's family. A suitor might try to impress the household with gifts, songs, or strength, but in the end, it came down to negotiations. Affection was a luxury. Fertility was currency. This emphasis on fertility created a society obsessed with signs of maturity. A girl's first menstruation was a quiet but powerful signal. For boys, facial hair, voice changes, and physical strength all mark their eligibility. And the entire community watched. You couldn't hide in your room and mope about growing up. You had to perform your role quickly and convincingly. If a boy was too soft or too small, he risked being labeled as unfit. If a girl was too outspoken or slow to mature, she might be ridiculed or deemed unlucky. These judgments had long-term consequences. They shaped who married whom, who inherited what, and who got sent away on dangerous sea voyages to prove their worth in wealthier homes. Some boys were sent to foster with other families, part tradition, part alliance building. There, they would learn adult responsibilities and absorb the values of a broader community. Girls, meanwhile, stayed home and prepared to run households of their own. They learned how to manage food stores through harsh winters, tend to the sick, and supervise slaves. There was no formal schooling, no second chances. You were trained by doing. And failure meant starvation, shame, or worse. Pagan religion reinforced these gender expectations. Gods like Thor, Freyr, and Odin embodied male power, aggression, and sometimes terrifying wisdom. Goddesses like Freya represented beauty, fertility, and cunning. Children were taught these stories early, and they internalized their lessons. Men protect, women nurture, men act, women endure. Of course, not everyone fit the mold. Some boys weren't interested in war. Some girls had no interest in marriage. But Viking society had little room for a deviation. You conformed, or you paid a price. That price could be social exclusion, legal punishment, or in extreme cases, exile. And that made puberty not just a biological phase, but a political event. The moment your body changed, your life did too. You were now a player in the Viking game of status, marriage, and survival, and there was no way to pause or rewind. So while modern teens worry about acne and algebra, Viking teens were worrying about dowries, death, and whether they were strong enough to kill a bear with an axe. Childhood was short, adulthood was long, and somewhere in between was a blurry, brutal rite of passage that no one really talked about because by the time you understood it, you were already living it. Death wasn't the end for the Vikings. It was a transition, a movement from one world to another, but it was also an opportunity for the living to show their devotion, for communities to demonstrate wealth, and occasionally, for rumors to start about things that probably shouldn't be happening round corpses. Viking burial customs were elaborate, varied, and frequently disturbing. Important people were often buried with their belongings, weapons, tools, jewelry, and sometimes boats. But that's not all. In some cases, people, usually slaves, were killed and buried alongside their masters. The logic was simple. If the dead needed items in the afterlife, they also needed servants. The chosen victims didn't get a vote. They were just part of the funeral arrangement, and sometimes this included sexual components. Accounts from Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan describe Viking funerals on the Volga River where a female slave was selected to accompany a dead chieftain. She was given wine, questioned repeatedly about her willingness, and then raped by multiple men in a ritualistic setting before being killed and buried with the body. The participants called it an honor. Modern readers would call it something else. It's important to note that this description came from an outsider, someone horrified by what he saw. But other sources, including archaeological evidence, suggest there may be truth to some of it. Burial sites have revealed remains of multiple people, signs of violence, and in some cases, indicators that the death wasn't natural. These weren't just ceremonies, they were power. Displays about who the dead person was, how much they owned, and how much influence they held even in death. But beyond the brutality of ritual killings, there were darker whispers still. Some medieval Christian writers accused the Norse of practicing necrophilia. While most of these claims were likely exaggerated propaganda meant to paint pagans as depraved monsters, they weren't entirely pulled from thin air. Norse mythology itself includes stories that blur the lines between life, death, and desire. There are tales of men falling in love with women who later turn out to be dead or undead. Draugr, the restless corpses of Viking lore, were often described as aggressive, territorial, and occasionally lustful. These creatures returned from the grave not just to haunt the living, but to assert dominance, guard their treasure, or, in some accounts, pursue old lovers. They were feared not only because they were dead, but because they still had appetites. These myths reflected deeper anxieties about burial, and resolved relationships and spiritual contamination. Sex with the dead wasn't seen as titillating, it was terrifying, a violation of both physical and spiritual boundaries. Yet it remained in the cultural imagination, suggesting it wasn't as far from reality as people wanted it to be. The dead, after all, still had a presence. Their memory influenced inheritance, household structure, and even marriage. A widow might be expected to speak to her dead husband during ceremonies. A son might be told that his bride resembles his mother, not in a sweet way, but in a literal reincarnation sense. The boundary between worlds was thin. That made rituals all the more important. After burial, families often held memorial feasts. These weren't just for mourning, they were for reaffirming social order, who got what, who married whom, who now led the household. Sometimes, these events included drunken toasts to the dead's virility, bravery, or romantic conquests, stories would be shared, some likely exaggerated, about who the deceased had loved, how many women he'd had, or what he'd done on his wedding night. Sex and death were strangely intertwined. The same fire that cremated a corpse might be used to light torches for a wedding the following week. The same hall that held a wake could host a matchmaking negotiation. Life moved on, but the legacy of the dead lingered, especially if it was complicated. There are sagas where widows keep their dead husbands' beds untouched, where sons sleep under the same roof as their father's concubines, where rival heirs accuse each other of sleeping with the deceased's lovers in order to claim legitimacy. These were more than just awkward family dramas. They were about power, property, and succession. The body of a dead man wasn't just a corpse, it was a symbol, and anyone associated with it, romantically or otherwise, gained or lost status based on public perception. In some rare cases, people even attempted to marry the dead, not romantically, but legally. A union performed after death could bind families, secure property rights, or avoid scandal. It might involve symbolic gestures like placing a ring on a corpse's hand, or reading wedding vows over a grave. The point wasn't love, it was legality. Death didn't end social contracts. Sometimes it created new ones, especially when there was wealth involved. Of course, not every Viking death came with drama. Most were quiet, painful, and forgotten. But the elaborate funerals, the legends, and the rumors all served the same function: to remind the living that the dead still mattered, that their actions, sexual or otherwise, had consequences that outlived them. So, whether it was tales of spectral lovers, ritualized violence, or accusations whispered in Christian texts, the Vikings left behind a strange legacy of intimacy and mortality. One where desire didn't die with the body, and where even the grave wasn't free of politics. In the Norse imagination, death wasn't the end of sex, it was just a change in context. And sometimes a very uncomfortable one. There were no clinics in the Viking Age, no contraceptives, no morning after pills, no health posters reminding you to think before you act if a Viking couple didn't want a child. They relied on luck, herbal guesswork, or something darker. Family planning in Norse society wasn't just underdeveloped, it was brutal. The most direct method was called exposure. It wasn't a secret, or even considered particularly shameful, if a child was unwanted, malformed, or inconvenient. The parents, usually the father, could simply choose not to raise it. The baby would be left outside, in the woods or near the edge of the village, where nature would take its course. This wasn't murder in their eyes. It was just a withdrawal of acceptance, a silent, cold refusal to acknowledge the child as part of the household. Sometimes the infant would die of exposure within hours. Sometimes animals would get to it first. Sometimes, though rarely, someone else would take the child in. But that was a gamble, not a plan. Exposure was legal. In many regions, it was even customary. If a man didn't accept the child by lifting it into his arms or placing it on his lap, a symbolic act, the baby was not considered part of the family. It was nothing. No name, no inheritance, no protection. The responsibility to decide fell entirely on the father. The mother had no legal power in this matter. If he rejected the baby, she could protest, cry, beg, but the final say was his. Sometimes this was used to punish women suspected of infidelity. If a child was born suspiciously early, or looked a little too much like a neighboring farmer, the father could disown it, even if he was wrong. There were no DNA tests, just community gossip and dangerous assumptions. There were also economic reasons. Poor families often exposed babies not because of shame, but because of starvation. One more mouth to feed could mean the difference between life and death for everyone else, in a society where winters were long, harvests uncertain, and food storage a constant challenge. Practical survival outweighed moral hesitation, still. It wasn't a decision made lightly. Some sagas depict characters haunted by the memory of exposed children. Others suggest that certain communities tried to avoid it through magic, negotiation, or hastily arranged marriages. But when all else failed, exposure remained the grim solution. That wasn't the only method of population control. There are scattered references, usually vague too. Herbal remedies intended to prevent pregnancy or induce miscarriage. These weren't consistent or medically reliable. They included plants like juniper, tansy, and yarrow, some of which do have mild contraceptive effects, and others which are simply toxic. The knowledge of these herbs was held mostly by women, midwives, wise women, or healers. But using them carried risks. If a woman was caught deliberately terminating a pregnancy, she could face social shame or retaliation, especially if the father had powerful family ties. The line between healing and sorcery was razor-thin, and once Christianity began spreading into Norse territories, that line became even more dangerous. Christian laws explicitly condemned abortion, infanticide, and any form of unnatural interference with birth. Pagan practices were rebranded as crimes. Healers became witches. Rituals became heresy. And yet, the underlying reality remained. People still tried to avoid having more children than they could support. They just did it more quietly. Within marriage, women were expected to produce heirs, preferably sons. But there was no guarantee. Childbirth was dangerous. Without modern hygiene, sterile tools, or trained doctors, giving birth was often deadly. Women died from blood loss, infection, or internal injuries. Babies died from suffocation, premature birth, or nothing at all. A successful birth was a gamble every time. Families that lost multiple children weren't seen as cursed. They were seen as normal, which made fertility a strange mixture of pressure and fear. To be a woman who couldn't conceive was a tragedy. To be a woman who conceived too often was a risk. To be a man who couldn't produce children was a humiliation. To be one who had too many, a liability. It is no wonder that family planning in the Viking Age wasn't about numbers, it was about damage control. Do what you must. Hide what you can. Pray to the gods or herbs or ancestors. And if all else fails, leave the baby in the woods and try again next year. Of course, not all children were exposed. Many were welcomed, celebrated, and integrated into extended family networks. Viking households often included multiple generations, slaves, foster children, and adopted orphans. Kinship was flexible when convenient, but legitimacy mattered. A child born from a proper marriage had rights, inheritance, social standing. Marriage prospects. A child born from a slave woman had none, even if the father was the same, and if the child was exposed and later found, tough luck. Its legal status was forever murky. Even if raised by another family, the stain of rejection followed it. Some grew up to become warriors or traders. Others became outcasts or slaves themselves. And no matter how strong, or clever they became, their origins could always be used against them. Viking society didn't forget. It remembered everything, especially your birth. So sex wasn't just about pleasure. It was about risk. Every encounter carried the potential to produce a life. And every life was a decision. Accept it, or abandon it, raise it, or release it, hope for survival, or prepare for grief. That was the unspoken reality of Viking family planning. It wasn't a discussion. It was a decision made quietly, and often alone. There's a common image of Viking men as fearless, dominant, and sexually insatiable. But the truth is, Viking masculinity was fragile, not just socially, but medically. Because while they didn't have a word for it, the Vikings absolutely dealt with performance anxiety. In a society where your status depended on your ability to dominate in battle, in trade, and in the bedroom, any failure in that last department could ruin your reputation. A man who couldn't perform was considered cursed, weak, or worse, feminine, and Viking culture had no patience for anything that even hinted at weakness. But what happened when things didn't work? When a marriage went unconsummated? When a man failed to produce heirs? When whispers began to circulate? There was no blue pill. There was, however, a wide range of rituals, spells, potions, and prayers. Sexual dysfunction was often blamed on supernatural interference. Maybe a rival cursed you. Maybe an angry god was punishing your pride. Maybe you accidentally slept with a spirit. The point is, it was never your fault, at least. Not publicly. This gave men an escape route. If you couldn't perform, you claimed spiritual sabotage. That bought you time. Maybe you'd see a seeress. Maybe you'd sacrifice something, a goat, a ring, a slave. If that didn't work, you could try herbal remedies. Viking herb lore included plants believed to heat the blood, increase strength, or restore vigor. The recipes were inconsistent and unregulated. Some included honey, garlic, onions, or even dried animal organs. Others involved more exotic ingredients like bear bile or eagle feathers. Whether they worked is another question entirely, but they gave the illusion of action, and sometimes that was enough. In extreme cases, a man might seek magical assistance in secret. This was risky. Practicing Saya, the Norse form of magic, was already considered suspicious, especially for men. A man who used Saya for sexual reasons risked public disgrace. If discovered, he could be branded as a man who had forsaken his masculinity. The punishment wasn't just mockery. It could include exile, outlawry, or in rare cases, execution. So men had to choose carefully, admit to failure, or risk being caught practicing forbidden arts. Neither option was great. Some turned to the gods. Prayers to Freyr, the god of fertility, were common. So were offerings at sacred groves or stone altars. You might carve your wish into wood, leave it in a tree, or whisper it into a stream. It sounds poetic, but it came from real fear. Because your manhood wasn't just about private pride. It was public currency. If your wife remained childless, people noticed. If your household had no heir, your property became vulnerable. If rumors spread, your enemies had ammunition, and Viking enemies didn't fight fair. They used everything: land, livestock, and libido. You might be challenged in court, not for impotence directly, but for failing your marital duties. That was good, and it could be enough to dissolve a marriage, remove your rights, or cost you valuable alliances. The law didn't need proof of dysfunction. It only needed witnesses, people willing to say your wife had been neglected, or that your house was cursed. In a world ruled by gossip and oral tradition, testimony was everything. And no one wanted to be the man who couldn't satisfy his wife, especially if she started looking elsewhere. Viking women, contrary to popular belief, weren't powerless. If they felt mistreated or ignored, they could initiate divorce. If they were high status, they could take their dowry and leave. If they were cunning, they could start rumors of their own. Some even turned to magic, using runes or charms to restore passion or weaken a rival. Whether it worked didn't matter. What mattered was perception. If people believed it, it had power. That's the quiet tragedy of Viking masculinity. It wasn't built on confidence, it was built on fear of being less, of being mocked, of losing control, and that fear extended into the bedroom, where expectations were high and privacy was low. Beds were often shared with family members, walls were thin. Gossip was thick, even consummating a marriage could be a public matter, with female relatives listening outside the door or inspecting the bedsheets. There was no space for vulnerability, only performance, and if you failed, the silence afterward could be louder than any battle cry. So Viking men did what they could. They prayed. They drank questionable potions. They blamed spirits. They accused rivals of curses, and sometimes they simply disappeared, left their wives, vanished into the wilderness, took up raiding to escape. Domestic shame. Death on a distant shore was easier to face than disgrace at home, and in the sagas, these men are rarely pitied. They're mocked, turned into cautionary tales. Their failure becomes entertainment. Their struggle, a joke. That's the cost of a culture that equates manhood with dominance and silence with strength. There's no room for honesty, no space for help. Just fear, ritual, and endless attempts to prove something that shouldn't have to be proven. In the end, the Viking image of raw sexual power may have looked impressive on the surface, but underneath was a quiet panic. A desperate race to keep up appearances. And for those who couldn't, there was only shame, or exiled, or both. In the Viking world, sex was never just about pleasure. It was about politics. Every intimate act had the potential to reshape alliances, elevate families, or destroy reputations. Marriage was the most obvious example, but it didn't stop there. Affairs, flings, and even one-night encounters could trigger feuds that lasted generations. Take concubinage, for instance. Viking men, especially wealthy or powerful ones, often kept concubines alongside their wives. These weren't always slaves, though many were. Some were free women, sometimes even of noble birth, who entered into informal sexual relationships with powerful men in hopes of protection, influence, or eventual marriage. But these relationships were rarely stable. A wife might tolerate one or two concubines, especially if they were low status. But if a concubine started acting like a wife, demanding things, bearing sons, receiving gifts, the household dynamic could explode. Wives could retaliate by accusing her, concubine, of sorcery, theft, or moral corruption, and those accusations carried weight. Viking law took magic seriously, and a charge of witchcraft could end in exile or death. All of this, of course, affected the children. A concubine's son might be strong, smart, and loyal, but he was still technically illegitimate. That didn't always stop him from claiming inheritance, especially if the legitimate heir was weak or absent. And that's when things got bloody. Brothers fought brothers, wives turned on stepchildren, entire lineages fractured over whispered accusations and forgotten nights. A moment of pleasure could mean decades of conflict, and it wasn't just men leveraging sex for power. Some women played the game just as well. High-status women, especially widows or unmarried landowners, had surprising freedom. They could choose lovers, make proposals, and even reject suitors publicly. These women knew how to use intimacy as a tool securing land, forming alliances, or gaining leverage over rivals. But they had to be careful. Too much freedom, and they risked being called loose to Littleland. They were seen as frigid or cursed. There was no winning, only balancing, and nowhere was this balancing act more dangerous than at court. Viking courts weren't like medieval European courts with tapestries and rules of etiquette. They were rugged gatherings of warriors, poets, merchants, and opportunists. In these spaces, sex became a weapon, A glance could forge a pact. A rumor could ruin a rival. Flirting was strategy. Affairs were negotiations, and revenge was always an option. Sagas are full of women who seduce, betray, and manipulate their way through tangled political plots. Sometimes they're framed as villains, other times as tragic figures, but always their actions carry weight. They remind us that even in a male-dominated culture, sex was a realm where women could wield hidden power. Sometimes it worked in their favor, sometimes it got them killed. The stakes were never low. Even poetry was political. Skalds, the Viking poets, didn't just write love songs. They wrote satire, curses, and praise. A well-placed verse could boost someone's status or destroy it. If a skald hinted at a scandalous affair, or mocked a man's performance, that man might lose allies overnight. Poetry wasn't entertainment, it was ammunition. And in a culture where legal evidence was scarce and public opinion meant everything, a suggestive stanza could do more damage than a sword. That's why kings and chieftains kept poets close. They wanted to control the narrative, ensure the verses praised their conquests and downplayed their weaknesses. If a rival's bedroom habits became the subject of public song, it wasn't just embarrassing, it was politically devastating. Because once the people laughed, they never stopped. The political uses of sex extended even to accusations of sorcery. A man might be accused of using love magic to seduce someone above his station. A woman might be blamed for stealing a husband through runes or potions. Whether the magic was real didn't matter. What mattered was the social fallout. These accusations could justify arrests, banishments, or executions, and behind the fear of magic was something more primal, fear of losing control. Because that's what Viking sexuality came down to: control. Who had it? Who lost it? Who pretended to have it? Whether it was a husband controlling a wife, a chieftain controlling a concubine, or a queen using seduction to steer council decisions, the struggle for dominance was constant. And the battlefield was often the bedroom. The most successful Vikings weren't the ones with the strongest swords. They were the ones who understood how desire shaped behavior, how attraction opened doors and jealousy closed them, how a quiet rumor in a longhouse could undo a year's worth of careful diplomacy. Viking politics wasn't clean. It was personal, petty, and often sexual. Every relationship had layers. Every gesture had meaning. A shared drink might lead to a shared bed. A shared bed might lead to a political alliance, or a betrayal, or a duel. There were no guarantees, only risks, and those risks could be fatal. That's why sex, in the Viking world, was never just private. It was public currency, a political tool, a narrative weapon. And, like all weapons, it could be turned against you at any moment. Vikings didn't have a concept of privacy the way modern people do. There were no locked bedrooms, no do not disturb signs, no quiet evenings with the door closed and the lights off. Longhouses were communal by design, open spaces filled with people, animals, firelight, and constant noise. Multiple families often shared the same space. Slaves slept near their masters. Children slept near the hearth. Guests might curl up on the floor beside the walls. There were no partitions, only woven curtains if you were lucky. And yet, people still found ways to have sex quietly, quickly. Sometimes not so quietly. In fact, discretion wasn't always expected. In many Viking communities, sex was just another human function, like eating or sleeping. It wasn't sacred. It wasn't private. It was normal. That didn't mean people were exhibitionists, it just meant the expectations were different. If a married couple wanted to be together, they did what they needed to do and no one made a fuss. Slaves, on the other hand, didn't have a say. They were property, not people, and their bodies were available at the owner's discretion. A master might sleep with a slave openly, without shame or secrecy. No one would stop him. It was understood. This system created a social world where boundaries were blurry. A child might grow up hearing the sounds of intimacy before they even understood what it meant. A teenage boy might lie awake near the fire while his uncle entertained someone behind a curtain made of old wool. A slave might be forced to endure a master's attention while the rest of the household pretended to sleep, and through it all, life carried on. This constant exposure to adult behavior shaped the way Vikings thought about sex. It wasn't idealized. It wasn't moralized. It was a transaction, a ritual, a release. Sometimes it was an act of love. Sometimes it was just another part of the day. Privacy didn't come from space. It came from silence. People pretended not to hear. They looked the other way. They changed the subject. It was a system of mutual denial everyone knew, but no one acknowledged. This was especially true for marriages. Couples were expected to have sex regularly. If a marriage remained unconsummated, the community noticed. Whispers started. Questions were asked. And in some cases, legal challenges were made. Yes, legal. A wife could sue for divorce on the grounds of her husband's neglect. The court would ask if the marriage had been fulfilled. If it hadn't, the contract could be dissolved. No passion required, just physical proof. Some sources even suggest that witnesses might be involved in confirming a marriage's consummation. That didn't mean people watched, but they might listen, or inspect the bed afterward. It sounds absurd now, but in a society where inheritance, alliance, and legitimacy depended on a single night, those details mattered, and again, this wasn't considered shameful. It was procedural. Like checking the hinges on a door or testing the sharpness of a sword, everything had to function, even sex. But function didn't always mean consent. Slaves, of course, had no legal protection. Their bodies could be used, traded, or punished. If a master impregnated a female slave, the child usually inherited a status, meaning more slaves. It was efficient, cruel, but efficient. Free women had more autonomy, but it depended on context. A high-status woman might reject suitors, choose her own husband, or initiate divorce. A low-status woman might have none of those options. If she was assaulted, her ability to seek justice depended on her family's influence, the attacker's status, and whether anyone was willing to testify. Rape, while technically illegal, was often hard to prove and easy to dismiss, especially if the victim was a slave, servant, or foreigner. The law codes made distinctions between different kinds of sexual offenses, but the enforcement was inconsistent. A man might be fined for violating a free woman. He might be praised for taming a slave. It all depended on who he was and who she was, and through all this, life in the longhouse continued. Meals were shared, fires were tended, children were raised. No one spoke about what they heard at night. No one asked questions. They just lived. It's easy to romanticize Viking domestic life: the flickering firelight, the carved beams, the smell of bread and pine wood, but the reality was messier, noisy, cramped, uncomfortable, and filled with moments no one wanted to acknowledge. That's the part most reenactments leave out. The awkwardness, the tension, the silent compromises, the way a woman might grit her teeth and endure her husband. Strong in advances because her mother-in-law was snoring 5 feet away, the way a young couple might steal 5 minutes behind the livestock pen because they literally had nowhere else to go. The way a slave might try not to cry while everyone pretended to sleep. These moments weren't unusual. They were ordinary, accepted, expected, and that's what makes them so disturbing. Because when everything is public, nothing is sacred. When everyone hears, no one listens, and when you have nowhere to hide, you learn to become invisible, or you become the problem. Adultery in Viking society wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a legal offense, a political liability, and sometimes a death sentence, unlike modern relationships. Viking marriages weren't primarily about love. They were contracts, property deals, strategic alliances. So when one partner strayed, it wasn't just about hurt feelings, it was about broken agreements and threatened legacies. That's why adultery was treated so seriously, not equally. Of course, men and women were held to different standards, as always. A man could have multiple sexual partners as long as they weren't married women of equal higher status, sleeping with a slave. Fine, sleeping with a concubine. Normal, sleeping with a rival's wife. Now you had a problem. Because that wasn't just adultery. That was an attack. It challenged another man's honor, disrupted his household, and questioned his ability to control what was his, Viking masculinity. After all, was about dominance, and if someone else could take your wife to bed, what else could they take? That's why adultery between powerful families often led to bloodshed, feuds, lawsuits, revenge killings. A few stolen nights could cost dozens of lives, and the sagas are full of these stories. Men who sneak into long houses, women who plot with lovers, husbands who discover the truth and go berserk. The details vary, but the outcome is usually the same. Someone ends up dead. Women, on the other hand, had far fewer options and much higher stakes. A woman caught committing adultery could be divorced, disowned, or executed, depending on the situation. If she was lucky, her family might shield her. If not, she might be paraded through town, have her head shaved. Or worse, Viking law codes mention penalties for unfaithful wives, and they're not subtle. In some cases, the punishment involved mutilation, like having part of the nose cut off. This wasn't just about pain. It was about shame. The disfigurement marked a woman permanently, broadcasting her guilt to the entire community. The point wasn't justice, it was deterrence. And while some of these laws were rarely enforced, the threat was always there still. Not every case ended in violence. Some women managed to navigate affairs carefully. If her husband was weak, absent, or politically expendable, she might get away with it, especially if a lover was powerful, or discreet, or both. There were even rumors of arranged affairs where husbands agreed to share their wives for political gain, inheritance manipulation, or personal impotence. These cases weren't common. But they happened, quietly, carefully, and always with plausible deniability. One strategy was to blame magic. If a woman was found in bed with another man, she might claim she'd been enchanted, bewitched by a love spell, or cursed by a rival. It sounds ridiculous, but it worked. Sometimes, especially if the man in question was known for a suspicious behavior. Magic, after all, was a convenient scapegoat. It explained everything and proved nothing. Adultery could also be weaponized politically. Accusing someone of sleeping around was an easy way to discredit them, especially women, if a rival wife was gaining influence. Just start a few rumors. If a chieftain's daughter refused a proposal, spread some stories about her nighttime habits. In a society where reputation meant everything, you didn't need proof, just enough gossip to plant doubt, and doubt was enough to ruin someone, sometimes permanently. But Viking society wasn't completely puritanical. Sex was acknowledged as a powerful, force tempting, risky, and sometimes unavoidable. That's why there were so many taboos, rituals, and rules designed to contain it, not to suppress it, but to manage it, keep it within the boundaries of law, clan, and tradition. And when those boundaries were crossed, punishment wasn't just for the guilty, it was for everyone. The family of the unfaithful wife, the children of the adulterous union, the household that failed. To maintain discipline, honor wasn't individual, it was collective, and that meant everyone paid the price, even the innocent. That's why some families went to extreme lengths to prevent scandal. Arranged marriages were carefully negotiated. Young women were supervised. Servants were questioned. Guests were watched. Long houses became surveillance zones, where trust was rare and silence was strategic. And yet, affairs still happened, because people are people, and rules don't stop desire. Not even strict Viking ones. The tension between passion and protocol never fully disappeared. It just simmered under the surface, and when it boiled over, it did so spectacularly. Affairs led to duels, divorces sparked clan wars. A single night of passion could change a village's entire power structure. That's the uncomfortable truth behind Viking sexuality. It wasn't wild or free. It was dangerous. And the people who navigated it successfully weren't the boldest or most romantic. They were the quiet ones, the careful ones, the ones who understood that in a world where everyone is watching, the smartest move isn't seduction, it's survival. So now you know, Viking sex wasn't a blazing saga of horned helmets and wild passion. It was messier, darker, more transactional. A system built not on love or even lust, but on property, power, and survival. The truth is that Viking society treated sex like it treated everything else, brutally practical. Marriage was economics, adultery was warfare, fertility was politics. Even pleasure, when it happened, had a price. The stories we tell about Viking passion, the fearless raiders with seductive accents and endless stamina, are mostly modern inventions. Historical fanfiction, because the reality was colder, louder, more awkward. Imagine trying to be romantic in a long house filled with goats, snoring cousins, and smoke that never quite leaves your lungs. Imagine your in-laws judging your performance from the other side of a curtain. Imagine worrying that if your wife didn't get pregnant soon, your neighbors would start whispering that you were cursed. That kind of stress doesn't exactly set the mood, and yet, somehow, people still found time to form relationships, to try, to care, maybe even to love. In rare moments, because humans will always try, even when the odds are bad and the walls are made of damp timber. But we can't ignore the rest. We can pretend that Viking intimacy was sweet and mutual, when so much of it was based on inequality, on silence, on fear. Slaves had no choices. Wives had limited ones. Children were accepted or exposed based on usefulness. And masculinity was a cage lined with expectations no one could fully meet. That's not romantic. That's exhausting. And still, generation after generation, the cycle continued, because it had to. Because the land was harsh. Because survival meant producing heirs, building alliances, and maintaining control of others, of yourself, of every whispered rumor that could unravel your household. So yes, Viking sex existed, but it wasn't sexy. It was a ritual, a burden, a strategy, and sometimes, when no one was watching and nothing was at stake, maybe it was even something more. But history doesn't care about those moments. History remembers the laws, the scandals, the punishments, The sagas full of blood and betrayal, the court cases, the curses, the consequences. It remembers who married whom, who betrayed whom, who got exiled for lying with the wrong person at the wrong time in the wrong place. Because in the end, Viking sexuality wasn't about desire. It was about what followed: children, shame, feuds, power. That's what made it dangerous and fascinating and worth remembering. Not because it was fun, but because it wasn't. So the next time someone tells you the Vikings had it all figured out, just smile and nod. Then remind them that in Viking times, your sex life could get you married, murdered, or mutilated, and not necessarily in that order. Thank you for watching.